Hello everyone, we are from the group 4. Our group members are Ramadhani Srizilani, Vivi Indriani and Muhammad Wafiuddin. And today we're going to present about national language and language planning.
National and official languages. A national language is the language of a political, cultural, and social unit. It is generally developed and used as a symbol of national unity. Its functions are to identify the nation and unite its people. An official language is simply a language which may be used for government business. Its function primarily utilitarian rather than symbolic. It is possible for one language to serve both functions. Official status and minority languages. English is an official in many countries throughout the world such as Pakistan, Fiji, Vanuatu, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. Interestingly, English is not legally an official language of England, the USA, or New Zealand. In these countries, it has not been considered necessary to legislate that the language of the majority is an official language. In New Zealand, ironically, although English is de facto, in fact or actuality, the official language of government and education, Maori and New Zealand Sign Language are the two languages which have legal or de jure status of official languages. Elsewhere, there have been riots over languages issues. Linguistic minorities in India have rioted where their demands have fallen on deaf ears. In Belgium, French and Flemish have had legal equality since 1963, but language riots in 1968 caused the fall of the government when they proposed to extend the French-speaking section of the University of Louvain. Many minorities would like to gain official status for their languages, but the costs in terms of providing service and information in all official languages are considerable, and most governments count them carefully. What prize a national language? Many countries have regarded the development of a single national language as a way of symbolizing the unity of a nation. One nation, one language has been a popular and effective slogan. The symbolic value of national language as a unifying point in the fight for independence was quickly appreciated in countries such as Tanzania, where more than 120 languages are spoken. In other multilingual countries such as China, the Philippines, and Indonesia, where there are large populations speaking hundreds of different languages, a national language is not only a useful lingua franca and official language, it also serves a symbolic unifying function for these nations. In Indonesia, the government did not select the language of the political and social elite, the Javanese, as the national language. Like India, some African countries have avoided selecting just one language as the national language, since the wrong choice could easily lead to riots and even war.
When the government chooses a variety as national or official language, it does language planning. Language planning is the deliberate effort to influence the function, the structure, or acquisition of a language within a speech community. In planning a language, choosing a variety depends on several factors like first, the form of the variety, the function it serves, and last, the attitude people hold toward it. The process of planning a language goes under four steps. The first step is selection. Selection is the process of choosing the variety to be developed. The second step, codification, is the process of standardizing its structural or linguistic features. This step is also called corpus planning. Number three, elaboration is the process of extending its function for use in new domains. And the last step is securing its acceptance. Is the process of enhancing its prestige and encouraging people to develop pride in it and loyalty toward it. The relationship between the steps is summarized in the table below. Selecting one code to be developed is often an entirely political decision, even though linguistics might point out the different linguistic problems presented by selecting one variety rather than another. Acceptance by the people will generally require endorsement by politicians and social prestigious groups. So, selection and acceptance are steps which involve social and political factors. Codification and elaborating the codes to handle a wider range of functions are, by contrast, essentially linguistic processes. The purpose of language planning: 1. Language purification is to prescribe the usage in order to preserve the linguistic purity of a language and protect it from foreign influence. The example is classical Arabic grammar books. Number 2. Language revival is to attempt to turn a language with few or no surviving native speaker back into a spoken means of communication. The example of this is Hebrew. 3. Language reforms is to deliberately change specific aspects of a language, such as orthography or grammar, in order to facilitate its use. The example of this is Chinese, which reduced the number of characters, and Turkish, which changed the character from Arabic to Latin. Number 4. Language spread is to attempt to increase the number of speakers of one language at the expense of another. The example is the spread of Spanish in Paraguay at the expense of native language Guarani. Number 5. Terminology unification is to develop unified terminologies primarily in technical domains. The example of this is the Arab Language Academy. And the last is language maintenance. It's to preserve the use of a group's native language as a first or second language where the pressure causes a decline in the status of the language. The example of this is Welsh.
The next is the linguist's role in language planning. Language academies have existed for centuries, but it's also true that individuals have often had an enormous influence on language planning, and especially on the standardization or codification of a particular variety. Samuel Johnson's 40,000-word dictionary was a landmark in the codification of English. Thought as example 7 demonstrates he had few illusions about the lexicographer's role. And in Israel, Eliezer ben Yehuda was the most influential proponent of the vernacularization of Hebrew, and the other examples. Moreover, these days, the nuts and bolts of language planning are handled by committees, commissions, or academies. Moreover, the focus of much language planning activity has altered from the promotion of national and official languages in countries trying to establish their autonomy to include concern for minority and endangered language. The Kanak Languages Academy, for example, has been established to preserve the indigenous languages of New Caledonia. Codification and vocabulary expansion are typically of prime concern for language academies. There are two main concerns of language planners: language codification and vocabulary expansion. The first one is language codification or orthography. In linguistics, codification is the process of selecting, developing, and laying down or prescribing a model for standard language usage. codifying a language can vary from case to case and depends on the stage of standardization that might have already occurred naturally. And orthography means the accepted way of spelling and writing words. In the past, the Church was probably the main influence on the written form of previously unwritten languages. Missionaries were trained to translate the people into the local language of the place where they were working, and this usually meant first developing a spelling system for the language. In the USA, for instance, Navajo, the Athabascan language of about 150,000 Navajos, was first written down by missionaries in the early 20th century. A century earlier in New Zealand, Thomas Candle was the first resident missionary produced a rough attempt at an orthography for Maori in 1815. Missionaries were often good linguists who produced a spelling system which accurately represented the pronunciation of the language. When developing the spelling system, inevitably there were problems, however. First one symbols did not correspond to the pronunciation. In Samoan, for instance, the sound "ng" was accurately identified as a single sound rather than two separable sounds. So for example, we have word whip and we translate to Samoan it was written simply as T A G I. In English, "ng" is identified as a single sound and it is different from "g". But in Samoan, both are the same. So "T-A-G-I" in Samoan is pronounced like "tangi" in Maori but spelled differently. The Samoan orthography is strictly a more precise presentation of its sound system. One symbol is used for one sound. These examples illustrate the influence of missionary could have on the codification process. The second one, different views on how to indicate the length of a vowel, double vowel versus macron. A recent problem in standardizing the spelling of Maori is the choice between a macron over the top of a vowel letter marking its length. For example, double vowel A versus A with macron, A dengan garis di atasnya. Wellington printers have preferred the macron, while Auckland printers have favored the double vowel. It was easier to read, less likely to be ambiguous, and economical to use macrons than double vowels in Maori, but word processors made the choice less useful. Second, vocabulary expansion. When the linguists want to expand the vocabulary, they choose a borrowed word from another language, an equivalent in the same language might not be well known or with a slightly different meaning that can be adapted, and a newly created word from the same language. This is what finally determines whether a proposed form succeeds or not, and this applies as much to an individual word as to new code selected to serve as a standard official language. The adoption of forms by the media can contribute to the process, but finally the people will decide. Having considered the linguist's role at the micro level of codification, it is useful finally to return to the macro level of language planning activities. In addition to corpus planning and status of prestige planning, which were discussed, sociolinguists may also make a contribution to organized efforts to spread a linguistic variety by increasing the numbers of its users. This is sometimes called acquisition planning, and since the most widespread method of encouraging the acquisition of a language is to use the education system. It is also known as language in education planning. Language planners may be asked to advise about a range of issues such as who should be the target of the language promotion efforts, the most effective language teaching methods in particular contexts, what materials should be used, and how the programs should be evaluated. Should everyone have access to language teaching, for instance? How much say should a local community have in the way a language is taught or the materials used, as opposed to a top-down uniform approach monitored by the government?